5 years ago, my buddy and I, both newly divorced, didn't feel like celebrating anything. So on New Year's Eve, we went up to my hunting cabin to get blind stinking drunk where no one could bother us. The cabin is probably what you imagine when thinking of a hunting cabin. One room, a few beds with a small kitchen, and a bathroom where men can sleep before going out the next day. Nothing fancy at all. We took 2 cases of Bud Light and a 5th of some cheap whiskey to either drown our problems or die trying. Got out there about 6 in the evening, fried up some steaks and began to drink. 2 hours later, while really only getting warmed up, we hear a loud cry come from the woods. I've been out on that land since I was a kid. My dad owned it before me and left it to me when he passed away. I know all the wildlife, have heard all their calls, seen everything out there that there is to see, and I've never heard anything like that before in my life. It was a mix of someone screaming in pain and anger, but too deep to be human. My buddy and I look at each other mid-drink. Neither of us could explain what that sound was. We sat there listening for anything else, but nothing happened, so we went back to drinking. Another shot, and a half hour later, we hear another cry, only this time it was much closer. It wasn't as loud as the last one sounded, but we could hear it better. My dad's old 30-30 was locked up under one of the bunks, so I went and got it, but the bullets were out in the truck. My friend and I went out to get them, but once outside, we heard a low growling coming from the left side of the cabin. After hearing that, neither of us wanted to go get the ammo, and we went back in and locked the door. I've heard mountain lion and bobcat growls before. I've even been stalked by a mountain lion once and got away by scaring it off. This was not that. I'm not sure what it was, and I can't even really describe it except for a growl. I can tell you we didn't drink for the rest of the night. We sat in the cabin for a bit, probably 2 hours, watching the door to make sure nothing tried to get in. After that, we tried again to get the ammo from the truck, and did so without incident. We took turns sleeping that night. When we went out the next morning, we looked around the cabin in the daylight and found tracks I had never seen before. The best I can describe them is that they looked like large human hands, with webbing in between the toes or fingers. Not sure what they were because they were long and thin. My friend and I didn't have our phones or anything to take pictures because, like I said, the plan was to get drunk without being bothered. The best I can do is describe what I saw. No idea what it was and never heard or seen anything like it again out there since I've been back more than a few times to my cabin. It was the oddest thing, and it was enough to scare 2 seasoned hunters half to death. A couple of years ago, my wife and I rented a cabin out in the woods for a quiet New Year's getaway. We spent a couple of days out there doing some snowmobiling and snowshoeing. It was a little 2-room cabin, nice and quiet. There was a living room area and a kitchen off of that, and then a bedroom with a bathroom attached to it. The cabin itself was 2 miles outside of a small town on the back portion of the owner's 15 acres. We went to a little event the town had to ring in the new year, and were back at the cabin by 1 in the morning. We fell right to sleep that night, but were woken up around 3 in the morning to a loud crashing sound. Someone was in the cabin with us. I heard footsteps that made it sound like at least 2 people were in there with us. The chair in the kitchen was knocked over, and then another loud bang as the front door slammed closed. My wife and I looked at each other like, what the hell was that? Then I grabbed my phone and called 911. It sounded like we were alone again, so I went out to the living room area to see what had happened. The front door had been knocked in but was still on its hinges. My jacket, my wife's jacket, and her purse had been stolen. My jacket had my wallet in it too. The sheriff showed up about 45 minutes later and took our statements. There were tracks in the snow leading back towards the edge of the property. The sheriff followed them as far as he could. They went through a wooded area back there, then ended at a street about a mile back where he lost the trail. No one was ever caught for the robbery. I don't know what the owner of the cabin did, if anything, to prevent something like that happening again. Last time I looked, he was still renting it out. I'm glad it was only a robbery. I canceled all the cards in our wallet, so the thieves only got about $100. Still, it was a scary experience knowing someone came in while we were sleeping. When I was 17, my parents let me go with my church youth group to a New Year's Eve retreat at a lodge in northern Montana. There were 14 of us, 9 boys and 5 girls. Of course, we slept in different parts of the cabin and the chaperones kept a close watch on us. But during the day, before it got dark, they let us walk around the woods by ourselves unsupervised. The temperature was in the low teens, so they probably figured if we tried anything, we'd get frostbite. Not that any of us girls would have fooled around with those boys anyways. They were very immature. We were walking around some trails behind the lodge. The boys were up front being loud and dumb, and the girls were in the back talking and catching up on what had happened over Christmas. Us girls weren't really paying attention to where we were going, but kind of followed the boys, and soon we realized we were off the trails. One of the boys yelled for everyone to come and look at what he had found. We all ran up to see because he sounded pretty excited, and all the other guys were already there, huddled around something and just mumbling cool to themselves. It was gross what we saw when we got there. It was a bunch of animal bones, and a little further off was a half-eaten deer. All the girls wanted to leave as soon as we saw it, but we weren't sure which way we had came. The boys refused to leave and kept looking around the area talking about wanting to find tracks. Next thing, one of the girls, Nancy, jumped and screamed, scaring me half to death. She said she saw something big in the woods and wanted to leave right then. Of course, all the boys were asking her what she saw, but she couldn't really say, just that it was big and hairy. Finally, a couple of the boys started thinking straight and convinced the rest that we should go. We hurried out of there, but every once in a while, someone would shout, "There it is," or "I saw something." The whole way back to the lodge, it felt like we were being stalked, and I particularly felt like I was being watched. Once or twice, we even heard the footsteps of something following us. We didn't run because under the snow there was a lot of ice too, since it had snowed, then thawed, then snowed again, so the paths were particularly slippery. I was so relieved when we made it into the cabin. We told one of the chaperones what we had seen, and they said it was most likely a kill from a mountain lion, and the lion probably wasn't too far away. We were lucky we weren't attacked or anything like that. The whole time heading back to the cabin, my mouth was dry and the feeling of anxiety was in the pit of my stomach. Looking back on it, the boys being so loud most likely kept the cougar at bay, so they were good for that at least. Still, a pretty spooky experience in my opinion. Back when I was a kid, my family and I would always go to our cabin from Christmas to the New Year's. It was about 40 miles from a small town. From our house to there was easily a 2-hour drive. The only way there was by driving a major 4-wheel drive out into the mountains off of a dirt road. To say this place was off the grid was an understatement. It had a well with a drainage field, but to use the bathroom we had to use an outhouse. My dad would have to bring fuel for the generator, and lights went off by 8 p.m., and after that we used candles or oil lamps to save on other fuels. Showers had to be kept to 10 minutes because the water heater didn't hold much, and again, we had to save fuel for the generators. Despite the lack of accommodations, the cabin was really nice. It had 2 stories and 4 bedrooms. A large den with a huge fireplace to heat the house, along with another fireplace upstairs in the master bedroom. Soft fur rugs lined the wood floors. The kitchen had a wood stove and oven. I remember Mom making fresh baked bread coming out of the brick oven. The smell and flavor was out of this world. During the day, we would go cross-country skiing, ride snowmobiles, or sled down the hill in the front yard. There was a clearing from the house to the woods about 100 yards in all directions, so plenty of space to have fun. There were also a lot of trails that my dad had cut through the woods to explore. Some of the best days of my life were spent up in that cabin, but there's one day that was also the most frightening. I was 15 years old, and as usual, we went up to the cabin for 2 weeks in the winter. For Christmas, my dad cut down the biggest tree that could fit in the cabin. Mom made food that made my mouth water, and Dad cooked his special cookies. It was the day after Christmas, and we were out doing some Nordic skiing. While out there, my dad found some prints in the snow he couldn't figure out. They looked like wolf or dog prints, but they were much too big to be either of those. Dad wore a size 12 shoe, and these prints were nearly as big as his. This was the only time I'd ever seen my dad get nervous. He started looking around the woods, and even followed the tracks for a bit, but didn't wander far so as to not leave my mom and myself alone. That night was unusually quiet. Normally, coyotes howl and owls hoot, but this night there wasn't a peep. This went on for 6 days until New Year's Eve. During that time, when we went out, we would find these huge tracks all over the place, until finally on New Year's Eve day, we noticed them up near the cabin. On New Year's Eve, we had our usual celebration. We played games and cards until midnight, when my dad would let me go out and fire off some fireworks. Normally, he would join me out there lighting them off, but this year he stayed on the porch with his rifle in his hand, like he was a guard at a jail or something. Mom was already getting ready for bed, and I shot off all the fireworks we had brought. After that, my dad told me to get to bed so we could leave early the next morning. I was in bed by 1, but I was having trouble sleeping. I think it was how weird my parents had been the last couple of days that had really got my mind thinking about what could have had them so spooked. My dad said he was worried about wolves being in the area since they had been reintroduced about a decade earlier and their packs had grown large. That kinda made sense, but didn't explain why he had been watching me like a jail warden that night. I tossed and turned for another hour when I started to hear faint scratching on the walls. 3 of the bedrooms in the cabin were downstairs. The master bedroom, a library, and the shower room were upstairs. So I was downstairs and heard the scratching. It started from the back of the cabin, and I could hear it moving towards me. The bed in this room was on the far wall, and across from me was the window. I remember the night was bright outside. The moon wasn't out, but the stars were so bright I could see the outline of the trees. The window was about 4 feet from the floor, so a decent ways up the wall. I laid there looking intently out the window, wondering what was making the noise and if I would see it when it went past the window. I mean, it clearly wasn't a tree branch. The trees were far from the cabin. Nothing came to mind as to what could be making the noise, and my imagination came up with all sorts of scenarios, from aliens to demons that could be out in those woods. The scratching would stop for a second, and then pick up again even closer to my room, when finally I saw what looked like the top of a dog's head come across my window. It stopped for a bit, and I could distinctly hear the sound of sniffing by my window. There was no way there was a 4-foot-tall wolf out in front of my window, so I couldn't figure out what it was. Then I saw the head start to lift up, and red eyes were staring at me. I laid perfectly still, too scared to even breathe, while this thing just looked at me. It must have stood the rest of the way up, because next its head was above my window, and I was looking at its chest. If I had to guess, I'd say this thing was well over 6 feet tall. The creature moved on silently after that, but in a few minutes, I heard it going up the stairs at the front of the cabin. The front door did have a deadbolt on it, which my dad always locked. He got the cabin 2 years before I was born, and said that on the second year when he went to check on the place, he found someone had entered it and trashed it. Ever since then, he always makes sure it's locked, even when we're staying there. This night, I was glad that was the case. The house was dead quiet, and I clearly heard someone try the doorknob. My heart was absolutely pounding out of my chest at this point. But then, I heard my dad come running down the stairs at the noise of the front door being tried. I heard him rack around in his bolt-action 308. I jumped out of bed and screamed for him not to go outside. I was afraid of the size of the creature I had seen and didn't want it to hurt my dad. He asked me why he shouldn't go out there, but I couldn't tell him. I knew how crazy it would have sounded and he probably wouldn't have believed me, so I simply told him I was scared because I had heard something too. He stood there for a moment in nothing but his long johns, and he must have seen the fear in my face, because instead of going outside, he came over and gave me a hug. He said everything would be all right, but he had to go out and take a quick look. So he went to the front door and opened it up, only poking his head out and looking around. He came back in pretty quickly and declared that there was nothing out there and it must have been the wind or something. He went upstairs and went back to bed. I stayed up for another hour, trying to calm down. Finally, I closed the blinds on my window and was able to fall into an uneasy sleep. Every sound and creak of the house woke me right up that night. The next day, after we had packed the car, my dad walked around the cabin to make sure nothing was left behind. I went with him, and on the wall by my bedroom, all the way to the back bedroom, we found a deep single scratch mark, almost the entire length of the cabin. He couldn't figure out what had made the mark, but I knew, and I never did tell him. One year, I wanted to really impress my girlfriend, now wife, so I decided to rent a cabin up on a ski hill for New Year's. It was kind of a package deal. We got the cabin, there was a party at the ski lodge. We also got a dinner and a bottle of champagne to celebrate. We got up there early and hit the slopes, got in a couple of hours of skiing before we went and got ready for the party. It was actually a pretty nice party with a DJ and a large group of young 20-somethings like ourselves there. We were drinking and mingling and got a few dances on the dance floor. There was another couple there that we didn't know, but everyone could hear them fighting until the guy got up and threw his drink in the girl's face and stormed off. The girl got up and ran off crying into the bathroom. My girlfriend went and followed her in. Half an hour later, they come out, and girlfriend introduces me to her and asks if it was okay if she hung out with us until midnight since her boyfriend had ran off. I kinda wanted it to just be me and my girl, but this other girl looked so sad and depressed that I said yes. We had a couple of drinks and talked over the loud music. The new girl seemed pretty nice and normal. We didn't ask about her boyfriend, but her and my girl went and danced a bit while I stayed at the bar. Midnight rolled around and we popped the bottle of champagne that went pretty fast, and soon it was time to call it a night. We walked her back to her hotel room. Her boyfriend still hadn't showed up, so we figured he must have left. We walked her to her door. She thanked us and said we were sweet for letting her have a happy New Year's, and we left. Our cabin was further down the road, but to get there, we had to pass by the back of the hotel room where the other girl was staying. We looked up to the second floor and could see her room with the light on. Next thing we know, we see her and who we assume was her boyfriend walk in front of the sliding glass door that led to the balcony. They were clearly fighting. We stopped and watched for a second, just kind of like, what the hell? When we see the guy deck the girl across the face. She must have tried to pull out her cell phone because we see him knock it from her hand and it crashed into the glass door, cracking it. I bolted to go up to her room and my girl was on her cell phone calling the hotel to report the abuse. By the time I get up there, 2 of the hotel staff are a bit down the hall and a guy runs from the room out to the exit for the stairs. The hotel staff followed the guy and I went to the girl's room. She was sitting on the bed with a bloody nose and a black eye. My now wife comes in not a minute later and hugs her. They both start crying and my wife consoles her. The police are there an hour later and take her statement and our statement. They end up taking her to her parents' house to be with family, and her and my wife exchange phone numbers. Long story short, we end up testifying at the court case since we witnessed the attack from the street. The guy gets 6 months for domestic abuse, which in my opinion was too short. My wife and the other girl are still friends to this day, and she was even a bridesmaid at our wedding. This happened back in 2019, so not that long ago. My friends and I all live in a small town, and we're pretty much just a bunch of crazy 20-somethings that like to party. None of us have gone to college. We all graduated high school and started working at the lumberyard in town, so we actually make good money and have very little debt. That's not really that important, but it's how we fund our get-togethers, and should kind of explain how wild they can get. We all went out to the woods, to a lodge we had rented for New Year's Eve, to have a bonfire and get smashed. There were 20 of us. I'm not going to list them all, but my best friend Jerry and my girlfriend Chanel were there, and the story pretty much revolves around the 3 of us. It was a wild time. There was a keg out there and so much liquor, I don't even know. Some people had passed out in the snow before midnight even hit. Well, the party was crazy. We all drank too much, and when midnight happened, we set off some fireworks. It was a couple hours after midnight. Jerry, Chanel, and myself, along with some other people, maybe 8 or so, had reserved some rooms to stay the night out there. Most everyone else had gone home by now. Chanel and I crawled into our bed, and Jerry went to take a piss. The bathroom must have been occupied because he knocked on the door and said he was going outside for a bit. Chanel and I started making out a bit, but I was too drunk and Jerry was going to be back soon, so I kind of started to doze off. Next thing I know, I'm snapped out of my stupor by Jerry screaming bloody murder at the top of his lungs. For a second, I thought maybe he had fallen in the dying fire or something, so I jumped up to check on him. When I got outside, I couldn't find him. He was gone. Now, we were in a pretty large field in the woods. He would have been stupid to walk all the way into the trees that were about a football field lengths away. I got out my flashlight and started to try and find his prints. Sure enough, it looked like the dummy had gone to the trees, but as I was following the tracks, they started to look like he was running. I even saw a spot where he had clearly fell and gotten back up, only to continue into the trees. About 4 or 5 other people had come out of the lodge at this point to see what the yelling was about and started to help to look for him too. We followed his tracks deep into the woods, calling his name as we went. Most of us were kind of sober by now from the shock of the yell, time, and the cold, but we still weren't thinking clearly and split up to speed up the search. Must have been almost a mile into the woods, still following his tracks, although it was getting harder, because under the trees the snow was thinner and I'd lose them for a bit but then find them again later on. Hypothermia was kind of becoming a concern, along with the fact that I had left Chanel back at the cabin. I was kind of worried about what had scared Jerry so bad to run this far and if it was still back there. So searching for half an hour now, calling out his name to no response. I can still see a couple of lights from the rest of the search party and hear them calling him as well. Then another scream comes from my right. I see the lights on that side of me run towards the sound. I keep looking for Jerry, and so do the people to my left. I didn't know everyone at the party, and the other name I hear being called out I don't recognize. 20 more minutes later, I lose Jerry's prints. We're so deep in the woods now, there is no snow on the ground. I get frantic, yelling, screaming, pleading for Jerry to answer me if he can hear me. Then the woods go quiet. The lights to the left of me are gone. I'm not sure what happened to them at this point. I don't hear anyone else calling for Jerry, and suddenly I feel very alone and scared. It's cold out. My fingers are numb and my feet feel like they're on fire. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid that Jerry might die out there if we didn't find him, but I was also afraid I might die as well if I didn't get back to the cabin. I took a second to think. I was also worried that if I went deeper into the woods, I might get lost, since there wasn't any snow to show my footprints in the path back. I decided that I'd walk until I couldn't see the snow anymore, and then turn around and walk straight back so I didn't get lost. So that's what I did. I walked as far as I could and continued to call for my best friend. I was about to give up, turned around and yelled one last time for Jerry, then stopped to listen. It was almost too quiet to hear, but I could have sworn I heard Jerry weakly say, "Over here." I ran in the direction that I thought I heard the voice come from, and about 20 steps later, I tripped over Jerry laying curled up on the ground. His nose was bright red, he was shivering, and his bare fingers were red as well. I did my best to try and get him to his feet. The dummy hadn't even brought a jacket. He had only been going for a piss, and I guess he didn't think he needed one. I slipped on a pile of frozen puke right by his face, but eventually got him up, and we managed to walk back to the lodge. When we finally got there, it was around 4 in the morning. We had been looking for Jerry for over 2 hours. Most of the other people had left, and Chanel and one other couple were there waiting to see if we got back. All the other cars except my truck and the other couple's truck were gone. Jerry hadn't said a word the whole way back. I figured it was because he was so cold. We climbed into the other couple's truck to warm up, and the other couple and Chanel told me what had happened. The other scream I had heard during the search was another search party. The guys to my right had ran to see why they had screamed. When they found the person that had screamed, they told them they saw something in the woods. They said it was white and very thin. It was walking on all fours for a bit, but after a moment with the light from their flashlights on it, it stood up, looked at them, and ran further off into the woods on 2 feet. They said it was easily over 6 feet tall, kinda looked human but not really, and they didn't know what it was. They also said that when the light reflected off its eyes, it came back pure red. I hadn't taken my phone with me out there, but I guess the group to my left had, and the group on my right had called them and told them to get the hell out of there. Kinda sucks they forgot to get me too, but whatever. When they got back, they all packed their stuff and split. The couple then asked Jerry why he had run into the woods, but he wouldn't answer. They asked if he had seen the same thing too, and all he did was shake his head yes. To this day, he won't talk about what made him run like that. If I ask, he just says, "I don't know, I was drunk," and then changes the subject. Pretty much none of us party in those woods anymore. Honestly, I'm just glad no one got hurt. And that's my story about what happened on New Year's 2019.